The first crisis was Brexit, which 62% of voters in Scotland opposed. Then came the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. The resulting rise in energy prices has hit Scots harder than other Western Europeans. Costs here are twice as high as in the Eurozone. Shops in Forfar are closing down one by one. With the National Health Service also in crisis, winter threatens to be precarious for many people.
Let them eat cake.
So what do you think about Scotland voting no?
There is a distinct lack of celebration. Always promising to make a positive case for the Union, officially in public they were better together. A collection of Labour and Tory politicians and staffers collaborating to save the UK. In private, however, they called themselves Project Fear, and were much more interested in the scariest of scare stories and the most cynical of distractions. This is a look back at how the most relentlessly negative and unimaginative campaign in political history was saved by questionable money from questionable sources. Out with Scotland, the most powerful British media organizations and a panicking UK state breaking its own rules. Why the No campaign needed to be a dark Project Fear type fantasy. Why there was actually no positive case that would stand much scrutiny. How reporters and politicians conspired to control the debate, misinforming a nation into voting no to its independence. At the heart of the story are the two main UK parties. Together they presented a dark vision of independence that looks a lot like the UK in 2024. It was a bleak fantasy then, but after a decade of Tory austerity and Brexit, it has become the British reality, a Britain, with Scotland stuck in it, unable to leave. In this episode, the nightmare reality of voting no. The UK 10 years on. Happy 10th anniversary.
Somewhere, tucked away in the North Sea of our planet Earth, there is a small island. Our island. This small island of ours, and the people who live here are bound together by more than earth and rock. We are bound together by over 300 years of common history, common achievements that measure far beyond our geographical size, and have made us one of the greatest countries on our planet.
And we set up Twitter squads. We had these people who were just tweeting aggressively, rebutting points, just getting out there and showing how competent we were in our arguments. So we had banks of people in our campaign headquarters. As soon as the leader of the Yes campaign said something, they were on it. We were just, oh, that's rubbish, that's nonsense. Strength, security and stability of the UK. Risk and uncertainty.
Not now, Rob.
An economic minefield where problems could implode at any time. an economic trapdoor down which we go, from which we might never escape.
Britain's big problem is just very low levels of investment. Low levels of investment by our firms, low levels of investment not only in kit, like it's actually hard to get something built in Britain for your company, but low levels of investment in their staff.
Between 1997 and 2017, investment from both private companies and the government was equivalent to 16% of the UK's GDP. That's 16% of the total value of the economy. But look at how that compares with other developed countries. We're last on this list, behind Canada, France, the US, Germany, and many others. The UK's level of investment has been low since the 90s, but in the years after the financial crash of 2008, the coalition government put the brakes on spending, and investment went even lower. Professor Diane Coyle at Cambridge University told us a lack of investment over decades has held back the economy and made the UK less resilient than comparable countries to shocks like Brexit, COVID, and the invasion of Ukraine. Productivity has long been a concern for the UK's economy. UK productivity has grown 0.4% per year since 2008. To put that in context, the average across other developed countries is 0.9%. For example, in Germany, the value of a worker's output is more than £47 per hour. In France, it's more than £51. But in the UK, it's around £43.50. And all of this affects how much people get paid.
So it is true that we as a nation cannot afford wage increases that are higher than inflation unless we have a productivity miracle. And we're not on the verge of a productivity miracle, unfortunately.
And increasing productivity is particularly hard because of the nature of the UK's economy. Our manufacturing industry has been shrinking for decades. These days, nearly 80% of the economy comes from services, like financial services, hospitality, and retail.
Services are lower productivity than manufacturing, so that again has slowly been putting downward pressure on productivity, and that again feeds through to real wages.
All of which means until the UK solves its productivity puzzle, its low wage growth will be hard to resolve. The UK is in one of the longest periods of slow wage growth in living memory. This graph shows the average wage in the UK. It's more than doubled since 2000. But look what happens when this is adjusted to factor in rising prices, to show how much a wage can actually buy. In the 15 years since the financial crash of 2008, it's hardly grown at all. Panorama asked the think tank the Resolution Foundation to look at the data on wages. It estimated that if wage growth had continued as it was doing before 2008, workers would have, on average, around £11,000 more a year than they do today. But that's not what's happened.
The wage stagnation of the last 15 years is almost completely unprecedented. Nobody who's alive and working in the British economy today has ever seen anything like this. Nobody thought it could happen, and I think there is a danger that we treat that as normal. We've got used to it over the last 15 years and we've forgotten this is definitely not what normal looks like. This is what failure looks like.
And this is being felt. In 2008, the typical German household earned over £500 a year more than the average UK household. By 2020, the gap was over £4,000, an 8-fold increase. Or, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies puts it, the slowdown in wage growth in the UK spells the end of the long growth in living standards, something that had lasted decades. The idea that each generation does at least as well as the one before has, for the moment, ended.
We're now like thousands of pounds. The typical Brit is thousands of pounds poorer than the typical German, the typical French person, the typical Australian, the typical Canadian. I mean, the typical American is now 60% richer than the typical Brit. It's not 6, it's 60.
This isn't an easy message to hear, and we're not hearing it from the politicians.
I think there is a lack of diagnosis or understanding of actually what the real structural issues facing the economy are. I think that's particularly true at a political level.
This is made worse by inequality. The UK's highest earners are among the richest in Europe, but our lowest income families are more than 20% poorer than those in France and Germany. That's nearly £4,000 a year lower than their French equivalents.
How did they get everywhere? How did they make everything so fucking second-rate? They're thinking they're better because there's more of them. It's not sweat on their palms. It's envy. It's resentment. And it stinks like a fucking drain. I am sick to fucking death of poor people! Yes! Fucking yes! Yes!
Inequalities are rising rapidly. There was an acceleration after the 2008 crash. The best off 1% take 14% of all income, the rest of 10% take another 14%, that makes 28%. That is a higher proportion than in any other country in Europe. We are now the most economically unequal country in Europe, and if things carry on as they are, we'll become the most economically unequal country in the rich world in the next 10 years or so. And we can also become acclimatized to extreme inequality. You feel it's normal to be living like this. You feel it's normal for some people to have so much and others to have so little. In particular, children who are brought up in a country with very high inequality don't see it as strange.
Would we in Scotland send out to the rest of the world? We, the people who found a way of cooperation across borders. We who pioneered a partnership between nations. We who have stood as a beacon for solidarity and sharing. What kind of message does Scotland send to the world if tomorrow we said we're going to give up on sharing? We're going to smash our partnership. We're going to abandon cooperation and conflict. And we're going to throw the idea of solidarity into the dust. This is not the Scotland I know and recognise, and we must make sure it is not the Scotland we become. Now,
since 2016, business investment has been growing in all other G7 countries, but not in the UK.
You can see that for a very long time, business investment was on an upward curve in the UK, but since 2016, in particular, the Brexit vote, it's been plateauing. And the government's been trying to rectify this, been throwing lots of money at it. They've introduced something called the super deduction, where you get huge allowances if you invest in capital and innovation, but it hasn't really shifted the dial.
Really worrying for the future of our economy, because in the end, investment drives the capital and the ability for economies to grow into the future. People don't know the direction of the UK economy. Inevitably, business investment doesn't grow as strongly. We've seen in all areas, in prices, in terms of investment, and in terms of trade, we're seeing negative effects due to Brexit, which we can now pinpoint as a Brexit effect, not a pandemic effect, not an energy crisis effect. These are very clearly Brexit effects. We see the UK pretty close to the bottom of the league table in terms of the forecast for economic growth, particularly in 2023. So the UK essentially sees no growth at all, and the only country that was worse than the UK was sanctioned Russia. Office for Budget Responsibility thinks that ultimately Brexit will cause the UK to be 4% worse off. It's about £100 billion a year that the economy is not producing, £40 billion of tax revenues or so. We are poorer because we're not getting that economic growth that we otherwise would have done.
Speaker, after 13 years of Tory failure, the average family in Britain will be poorer than the average family in Poland by 2030. Exactly. That's a shocking state of affairs. If the Tories limp on in government, we're going to see a generation of young people learning to say Auf Wiedersehen pet in Polish, aren't we?
Minister.
Minister Keir Starmer spoke about this, and he was saying that the UK was recruiting too many people from overseas, that immigration wasn't the solution. The SNP would argue that it would be, that actually Brexit has made the workforce issue much worse. So who's right?
The reality is you are not going to solve the recruitment crisis by simply recruiting people from overseas. We need more Scottish...
But it would help, would it
we
not?
need,
Especially in the
of course it would
term.
help, but it's a short-term sticking plaster.
Officials have offered to meet the family of a young autistic man who died after being left starving and desperately thirsty at the Royal Blackburn Hospital while waiting for an operation. Mark Stewart spent 5 days in agony and died following a series of failings. His parents say they have been battling for answers for 4 years.
The NHS isn't just in a crisis, it's in a polycrisis. It's across trust, hospitals, mental health, primary care, social care. Every part of the system is stretched to breaking point. The figures that stand out are the ambulance handover waiting times, the length of time that patients are having to wait in A&E, the number of patients who are having to wait on waiting lists for elective surgery. I mean, every bit of it, cancer treatments that are delayed, you name it. There's almost nothing that it doesn't have a long waiting time attached to it now.
The Royal College of Emergency Medicine has claimed that the crisis is now so acute that it's caused hundreds of excess deaths every week.
Well, that is their claim, and I've seen some very good statistical analysis of it to show that they are in the right ballpark. This was denied by NHS England, who said that it was much more complex than that, but subsequently the Royal College of Emergency Medicine and others have come back and said yes, because if you have to wait in an ambulance to be handed over into the emergency department and you've had a heart attack or a stroke, that is inevitably going to have consequences. Every hour of waiting time is going to cause further problems for those who are truly sick. And then we don't know really what happens once they're getting into hospital. There's all the issues with the low staffing numbers, particularly low numbers of nurses. So yes, probably in that ballpark.
We need more
But
Scottish...
it would help, would it
we
not?
need,
Especially in the
of course
shorter
it would
term.
help, but it's a short-term sticking plaster.
Real risk 4, prices rising in the shops, unaddressed by the SNP. Real risk 5, interest rates and mortgage rates going up, unaddressed by the SNP.
A major study has revealed an explosion of extreme poverty in the UK. The study, published by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, has found that severe material hardship is no longer a rare occurrence in the UK. The rates of destitution has more than doubled in the last 5 years. The report attributes the same to benefit cuts and the cost of living pressures, which has left thousands struggling and increasingly reliant on regular charity handouts. The report also raises concerns particularly about children, including physical ill health, undernourishment, mental illness and social isolation, school absences and poor classroom behaviour. An estimated 1.8 million UK households with nearly 3.8 million people were destitute at some point last year. These families include over 1 million children. Half of destitute households tried to get by on less than £85 a week, after housing costs, with a quarter reporting no income at all. The study also found that many adults reported a frequent inability to afford more than one meal a day, often going without so that their children could eat. There was a heavy reliance on food banks or relatives for groceries. More than half of destitute adults regularly went without toiletries such as shampoo and toothpaste, as well as hygiene and cleaning products. The phenomenon, once largely limited to immigrants ineligible for social security support, is now being predominantly experienced by UK nationals who are recipient of welfare benefits.
Destitution, a single person who has less than £95 per week. We're talking about people who are unable to meet their most basic physical needs to be warm, dry, clean and fed. This is the most severe form of hardship and deprivation in our country, and it has doubled in the space of 5 years. And so that is what we want to see the government talking about, that very sharpest end of hardship. And we want to know, both from the government but also from the opposition parties as well, what is it that they are going to do about this? When we look at the what's happened over time, we've seen between 2017 and 2019, destitution was rising in that period as well. It's risen again since. So yes, definitely the cost of living, the very sharp increases to food and to energy has played a part here. But actually the roots of this are much deeper, and they go to the very threadbare social security system that we now have, the cuts and freezes to universal credit, to social security. That is a big driver of what we are seeing here.
I mean, your report today talks about how, you know, social security needs to be more generous. You know that's an incredibly controversial political idea that neither party may be looking at.
I don't think it is that controversial an idea. When we talk to the public, when we do opinion polling, when we go out and speak to people, what we find is that people very much support the idea that our social security system should be there for us when we fall on hard times. Life can come at you fast sometimes. Any one of us can lose our jobs, can be sick, get sick, need to care for a disabled family member. You know, things happen in life, and when they do, social security should be there to help us get back on our feet and move on with our lives, and our system is currently failing.
But I mean, the government's stated aim of universal credit is that it will provide a basic income for people, which covers a range of needs. Do both of you, either of you, think that is true?
No, I mean, 7 in 10 people who are experiencing destitution were in receipt of social security payments, so universal credit or other benefits. It's clearly not actually helping people to meet their needs, and that's why we've been arguing for an essentials guarantee to be built into universal credit, so that it is always enough for people to meet life's basic essentials.
But do you think that, you know, it's that idea of what is enough, and that the government with the benefit system may have an idea of what is enough, but this destitution report suggests that's not right?
Well, it's never, our social security system, the basic rate of social security of universal credit is £85 per week to cover food, utility bills, clothes, travel, all sorts of things. That it's clearly not enough, and it has never actually been related to a costed basket of essentials. It's just a sort of historical accident and a series of decisions about how to operate it. So it's completely disconnected from the realities of what it costs to meet your needs.
And a lot of the reporting today about this has been about the connection between life expectancy and austerity, and that austerity has had an influence on that. Why do you think that is?
We first saw the beginnings of this around about 2012. By 2013, data was being released showing that elderly women in Britain, the life expectancy had fallen by about 2 weeks. Elderly women are particularly likely to live on their own. They're more likely to be in need of care and help from the state. And the kind of things that were happening after austerity was introduced, which remember as long ago as just after 2010, was that the number of adult social workers who go and visit elderly people was halved. Rural bus services were cut, Meals on Wheels were cut in a huge amount. And at first the most elderly and the most frail women and then men began to die faster. Our life expectancy stopped rising in 2014. The latest life expectancy for the UK for both men and women is still below the level that was reported for 2014. And people have looked at every other possible cause. They've looked at cold winters, they've looked at influenza, they've looked across the whole of Europe, and nowhere else in Europe has had this terrible thing happen, life expectancy actually dropping.
Weaker economy, lower wages, higher inflation, higher interest rates, increasing inequality. Public services suffer a decade of austerity. NHS in crisis. Staff on strike. Lower life expectancy, the worst in Western Europe. Scotland already behind independent neighbours. Gap growing. If you don't do anything about it, that is.
Gordon Brown there with a barnstorming speech which certainly